So today's daf is daf Kuf Bet 102, and where are we? I don't see it. Oh, there we go. Okay, so 102. So we said yesterday a very interesting mission, as you recall, that a man marries a woman who has a child from previous marriage. He asks her new husband to commit to feed this child, and he does. And then she gets divorced and remarried and asked another husband to feed the child. And so we had all that detail yesterday. And then we transition into this case. I mean, we'll start again from the beginning of the Gemara, if that's okay, on Kuf Aleph on the back.
Great. Yeah.
We said, person goes to his friend and says, in front of two witnesses, I owe you $100, right? That's why he would do this. There's a debate in Sanhedrin about this, but simply he wants to look like he doesn't have a lot of money, or he likes the guy, but he doesn't really owe him money. The Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayav to pay. Doesn't matter, you accepted it.
Seems like he thinks he does.
It's like you said, he's patur from paying. She says to him, 1 second, let's figure out the case. He said, look, I owe you $100, and these two gentlemen here are my witnesses. Then obviously he made it official. Then of course he's got to pay. My time If he didn't designate the witnesses, he's just stopped talking. People talk all the time, right? You're sitting around with your friends and you say things that are ridiculous. So it doesn't have any force. My time The issue is that he did not designate them as witnesses, which would have made it a clear chiyuv. But what he did do, he wrote it down on a napkin in the bar, right? He wrote down on a piece of paper, I owe Ruvain owe Shimon $100. And two witnesses saw this, but no one signed. So this is how Rashi understands it, or Tosfos too, that it wasn't a proper shtar, right? Obviously, if it was a proper shtar signed by witnesses, there'd be no question either. But he wrote it down, so it was essentially like saying it without any kind of proper procedures. So Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayav because alima milta de shtar. The shtar has a power to it, and this was certainly true back in those days. Remember, shtarot were very powerful. They had very few written documents. When we had the rule that if you write something down and witnesses sign it, that you can even collect from any mishubadim because everybody knows about it. So clearly, it made a big enough impression. It was not like writing on the back of a napkin, as I said. So says Rabbi Yochanan, that's impactful enough that you have to pay. And Reish Lakish amar patur, because it's not enough. You have to designate witnesses, otherwise it's just games. And lo alima milta d'shtara, it's not strong enough. So it's not. Now, the reason we bring this whole machloket is because of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says a man marries a woman, isha, right? You agree with her that you're going to feed her, provide source food for her daughter from a previous marriage for 5 years. Says the Mishnah, you have to do it for 5 years. Now, the Gemara is assuming that it can't be that you had a proper contract and that you made a deal and you wrote it properly. Because otherwise, of course, you got to pay it, right? If I make a deal and I write, I'm going to go to the Yankees games and pay your tickets for 4 years, you got to do it. Like, there's no question. It must be a case where you did this kind of sort of deal where you not said it, right? But you wrote it down, but didn't write it formally with witnesses. So it was an informal kind of writing.
I thought the question was whether these kind of clauses would survive the marriage, meaning, once she gets to ketubah, all the other clauses in the ketubah go away.
So it's right. So again, it's not necessarily this is written in the ketubah. I mean, I think this is written at the time of marriage, but just to remember that many of the clauses in the ketubah are not written in the ketubah, right? So if you recall, our ketubah is much shorter than the many things that a person's chayiv when they have a ketubah. So I think the fact if it's written down and signed, then it would clearly be in force. That's our assumption. I know we're making a little bit of a jump here, but that's the assumption. So that it's talking about it was not written in the ketubah, so Rashi understands it, but that he wrote a separate document and saying, I'm going to feed your daughter for 5 years, and he handed it to her in front of witnesses, maybe at the wedding, but not writing on it officially. The witnesses signed it, so it wasn't a regular shtar. It was this kind of half shtar. That's the assumption. So we want to prove from our Mishnah. Here it says you have to pay her. My lav ki agavna. It must be it's similar to this case where you write it down, but you didn't, cross all the T's and dot all the I's, and you have to pay. So that supports Rabbi Yochanan. Says more low. It's talking about, and this is a fascinating addition to our collection of shtarot, something called a shtarei psikta. A shtarei psikta, posek literally means agreement. So they used to have a contract where they sort of made the terms of the marriage. And so this is something that's very unique to marriage. Usually you don't go into a relationship, if you're a business partner, where you have the terms in the same way you would do for a wedding. Obviously you have terms, so you write them down. But in terms specifically of marriage, there is a concept of what's called a shtar psikta, which means a mutual agreement about how you divide, who's paying for the wedding and who's paying for the house and which parent's giving this and giving that. And those actually have much more force in the context of marriage than they would in any other context. And that's Rav Gido. That, in fact, is what Rav Gido is quoted as saying in the top line of Kufbet. Damar Rav Gido Amarav, Kama ata noten lebinecha, right? The way it would work, I've never been in this negotiation yet, but the father of the parents of the chatan sit down with the parents of the kala and they say, how much will you give to your son? Kach v'kach. And how much do you give to your daughter? What are you giving her? What's her dowry? Kach v'kach. So they sit down and they negotiate. You're gonna bring this many suits into the wedding and this many that, et cetera, et cetera. And then do the kiddush, and then they get up and they do the kiddushin. Then kanu, then that it seals, even though they did not write and sign it. Like we're making the assumption that they said it in front of witnesses, but they didn't have a formal contract. But they sat down, they had what we call t'naim, essentially, right? They had the agreements and they made a negotiation, and then it's enough. And says Rav Gido Marav, hein dvarim haniknim ba'amira. This is one of the rare exceptions. We have objects that are koneh through just saying. Usually you have to write things down or have witnesses. But here, because it's in the context of marriage, we assume, and we'll see why in a second, why we assume this, but we assume that there's a greater power to the agreement, and maybe because people are all in good moods when they're getting married, or people are used to dividing resources when they get married. And so in that context, words have much more power than usual. And therefore, when the husband said, I'm going to support your daughter, the fact that he said it in front of witnesses, he doesn't even have to write it down for it to have force according to everybody. Now, Tashma, let's try to see another similar kind of case where, for example, a man is katav l'kohen, a father of a child, right? A child is born, a firstborn son. You have to do pidyon ben. You have to give 5 sla'im to the kohen. The father goes to the kohen and he writes, katav l'kohen shani chayav l'chamish sla'im. Instead of giving the kohen 5 sla'im, he writes a document. It says, look, I want you to work for me. I want you to be the kohen for my son's pidyon ben. Here is a check that says, check's probably different because it's on a bank account, but so they didn't have banks then, but he writes a document saying, I so-and-so agree.
IOU.
5 sla'im. Yeah.
It's an IOU.
It's an IOU, exactly. I will give you 5 sla'im. Says the Braita, chayav liturn lo 5 sla'im. You got to pay him 5 sla'im. Now, we are assuming as well that this is not written with witnesses, because if you wrote it with witnesses, of course you pay him. Why wouldn't you? So we're assuming here that this is a case where you wrote it and didn't sign it, like the case in Sanhedrin. It's like you wrote it, but you didn't sign it. Says this Braita, you have to pay 5 sla'im. But no, ain't no padoy, but it doesn't work. The kid is not padoy. You got to find another kohen or give another kohen 5 sla'im. Says Gemara, one second. That's no proof, because shani atam, it's true that it seems from that Braita that just writing it is enough, even assuming that nobody signed it. But that's different, because there's essentially already a shibud. There's already a responsibility to pay the kohen, because the Torah says you got to pay the kohen. So you're starting off in a point where you owe money to someone for this kid. So the fact that you wrote it to this kohen means you have to pay it to him. But if you came up to a stranger or your friend out of the blue and just said, I owe you $100 and wrote it down, says Reish Lakish, it doesn't prove anything. So this is a unique case because there's a pre-existing responsibility, right? Shani hatam demishubad le'midoraita. The Torah basically said you've got to redeem the kid. So therefore your action has much more impact. Says the Gemara, 1 second.
So why isn't the kid redeemed?
Beautiful. Why? Where am I? So, well, 1 second. I'll tell you in a second. The Gemara asked that in one line. Before we ask that question, the first question is on my katav. So why'd you even write it? right? If you owe money to the Kohen Midoraita, the Torah says you got to pay 5. Why do you write it on paying you 5? What you're doing here is Kedei Levarer Lo Kohen, right? When you have as the father of the kid, you can choose any Kohen in the world to give your 5 slayim to. You want to reserve the very best Kohen. This guy does a juggling act, he's got the whole clown suit on. You want to reserve this guy who's high demand. So you write him an IOU saying, I'm gonna redeem my son through you. And so then this guy will show up to your Pidyon Ben. Says the Gemara, 1 second. As you just asked, James, why in the world then doesn't it work? You're hiring a Kohen, you're not hiring him, you're paying him. Why doesn't it work for what the Torah requires? Says Gemara, of course it works, but it's a takana midrabanan, it's kidu'ula. The Amar Ula, as Ula said about this case, Devar Torah Padoy, Likashite. According to the Torah, again, the document doesn't have any force. Giving an IOU to a Kohen is not paying the Kohen, according to the Torah. The Torah looks at cash, or what they call cash, sla'im. So, but if you did pay it up, because you have to pay it up, your kid should be Padoy when you pay it up, right? You gave a document to the Kohen saying, I'm going to pay you $5. I don't have any money right now. The next day you go, you get the money, and you pay him, your kid should be Podeh then. But they made a takana that it doesn't work. My time Amru Beno Eno Padoy. Why did the Chachamim say that it doesn't work and you have to do it all over again? Because Gzeira Shema Yomru Podin B'Shtarot. We're afraid that people will make a mistake and they'll come to your Pidyon Ben, they'll remember the juggler, right? And they'll see that you didn't actually give cash to the Kohen, you gave him a check. Again, the check is not the same, right? But you gave him a document that says, I will pay you. And that's not enough. Now, it turns out the next day you pay him and your kid's not put that till the next day, but they made a takana that if you did it through a check, through a shtar, it never works, even after you pay him. You got to start over and do it through dollars because you don't want anyone to make that mistake. So anyways, so unrelated, so therefore you can't prove from this case because it's a unique case of Pidyon Haben. Amar Rava, says Rava, in fact, it's Ketanai. There's a Machloket Tanaim about this specific question about whether, essentially, if you write something in the shtar but don't sign it, whether that has the force of verbal, which is nothing, or it has the force of a shtar. And what's the case here? Says the Braita, let's say you have an arev hayotzei achar chitum shtarot. Very interesting case. Remember that on a shtar you would write, I Ruvain, O Shimon, whatever, and then the witnesses would sign at the bottom, right? And now very often, as banks today or as people who rent apartments, that they wouldn't trust you. You don't have any money. I'm not lending you $10,000. How are you going to pay me back? So you'd have an arev. Arev means a guarantor, right? So you'd have a guarantor who would sign on the bottom of the shtar and say, and if he doesn't pay back, I'm also responsible. The same way, for a lease or a mortgage or whatever. And so the issue here is that instead of what normally happens, where Ruvain writes, I owe Shimon $10,000, and below that the Arev writes, I, Levi, am the guarantor, and I will pay if he doesn't, and then everyone he signs, there was a signature after Ruvain said he owed Shimon money, and then the Arev wrote below that in the shtar. So after, remember, shtars were chronological, right? So after the signature, a person wrote on the bottom, and I'm Levi, and I'm going to make it good if anything falls apart. So the issue there is that Levi signed after the witnesses. So the witnesses were not witnesses on Levi's signature. And so essentially Levi wrote down his responsibility, but he did it without witnesses. So that's almost the same case as Rav and Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, right? Where basically you wrote it down, but without proper witnesses. So what's the case there? You have an arev, you have a guarantor, hayotzei, who comes out, meaning they sign the shtar, achar chitum shtarot, after the shtar has already been finished. So after the signatures. Says the Braita, goveh min nechasim mipnei chorim. It doesn't count. You have a responsibility, but you can only collect from the nechasim b'nei chorim, because a shtar requires you, remember, to collect even from things that were sold. But because this was written after the shtar was signed, it doesn't have the force of being written in the shtar. It's as if it's what's called a milveh al peh. It's as if a loan is done by mouth, which you have to pay back, but you only pay back from free property. If you sold something, you can't go and collect that thing that the person sold to collect the debt because they couldn't have known about it. So that's the equivalent here. You're goveh min nechasim b'nei chorim. That's what Rabbi Yishmael said. Amar lo ben Nanas, I don't agree with you at all. You can't collect it all. It doesn't count. The fact that he signed his name and said, I'm an Arev, doesn't matter. Because since he signed after the witnesses, which seems to be exactly what Rish Lakish said before, it implies that it's not enough. Now, Rabbi Yochanan said back to Amar lo lama, why in the world doesn't he have to pay? Amar lo, because look, let me give you an example. It's a funny example. 4 lines from the bottom. Right? A guy is choking his friend in the shuk. Someone owes someone else $100. He's standing here in the shuk with a baseball bat, about to smack his kneecaps. And matzah chavero, and his friend comes and sees the scene. Literally, it's what it means. He's choking him to get his money back. And someone else comes on the scene and says, wait a second. Don't. He's like, why are you choking him? Because he owes you money? I'll pay you back the money. Let him be. Leave him. They had mafias back then too, right? I'll leave him. Patur. Says Ben Nanas, you don't have to actually pay back the money because obviously you didn't mean to say responsibility. You just wanted to stop choking him. Because the whole point of a guarantor, this is a fascinating argument, is that you only are chayav as a guarantor if at the time that he made the loan or rented the apartment or sold the house, he did it on the basis that, look, I'm selling this to you, Ruvain. I don't really trust you, or you don't have a lot of money. Your father or whoever has to sign as a guarantor. So that's the initial deal was done with that person as a guarantor. But in a case where you made the loan, it had nothing to do with any other party. After the fact, someone showed up and said, okay, I'll pay it back. There's no responsibility in so that's just words, unless you write it down in a shtar, of course. But as long as you don't write it down and you don't have a confirmed document, you're just basically saying it to make him feel better or to stop choking your friend, right? But there's no actual responsibility. And so it says Ben Nanas, the fact that there's a shtar, it says Reuven Oshima money and signed by witnesses. And then after that, I wrote on it, Levi wrote, I will pay up if Reuven doesn't, means nothing. The loan was made without this guarantee and there's no responsibility. Now, again, if Levi wrote it and signed it with witnesses, that's like a new obligation for Levi. He's making a new responsibility. But as long as there's no witnesses on his signature, it has no enforcement at all, according to Ben Nanas, which sounds exactly like what Reish Lakish said. So says the Gemara, it seems like 2 lines from the bottom. Lema Rabbi Yochanan Damer Rabbi Yishmael, Reish Lakish Damer Ben Nanas. Says the Gemara, well, it's not so clear because I'll leave it to Ben Nanas. It's true. According to the Tana Ben Nanas, Kuli Amalo Pligi, turn the page. That in fact Ben Nanas very clearly says that the fact that Levi wrote, "I'm a guarantor," but no one signed it, is no responsibility. There's no question that you wouldn't have to pay anything. But ki pligi aliba de Rabbi Yishmael, the machlokas is according to Rabbi Yishmael, right? What's the issue according to Rabbi Yishmael? Rabbi Yochanan says, I hold like Rabbi Yishmael, that just like you signed as an arev on the shtar, you have to pay, at least me b'nei chorim. The same thing is true if I go to my friend and I say, I'm going to pay you $100 and I write it down on a piece of paper, but nobody signs it, I got to pay $100. But Reish Lakish says it's not the same. Ad kan look Amar Rabbi Yishmael hatam el d'shayach le d'shibuda deoraita. There, it's conceivable that you can do what's called a shibuda deoraita, meaning the concept of arev is a well-established concept in the Torah, right? Or midoraita. The Torah, in halachic principles, we have a very well-established concept of an arev. You did it wrong here, but essentially you're filling a role that's an established role, and so therefore you're quasi have to pay, right? Meaning b'nei chorim, you got to pay, but it's only b'nei chorim. But here, lo shaykh shibuda doraita, there's no precedent in the Torah for a person walking over to another person and just saying, I owe you money, right? Without a context, people give gifts all the time, but you can't necessarily make it into a shibud. By making it into responsibility, in the Torah always means, I lent you money, I sold you something, I gave you something, but just walking over to someone, there's no precedent. Now again, if you have witnesses and you sign it, you could make yourself responsible for anything. But here you didn't have witnesses. Right, and so therefore there's nothing to sort of hang on to. So unlike the arvut, the guarantor, which has a precedent and therefore you'd be chayav, says Reish Lakish, I think that even according to Rabbi Yishmael, you would be patur in this case. So that's where we are. Now it says the Gemara. Let's go back to getting married. Right, that's really our topic here in Ketubot. So Gufa, 5th line. Gufa. Amrav Gido Amarav. A man says to another person, say a father says to another father, Kama ata notein levincha, how much money are you going to give for your son for this marriage? Kach v'kach, $1 million or whatever we demand for our daughters, right? And Kama ata notein lebitcha, and turns around, how much are you going to give for your daughter? It says a couple suits, as we said yesterday. Kach v'kach. Anyways, they make whatever, they negotiate. You get the summer home, you get the car, you get the boat, right? Everyone, what are you bringing into the marriage? And then they finish and they sign their hands, they make a l'chaim, amdu v'kidshu, they get up and they do kiddushin. Now, kiddushin does not mean they kiddush, right? Amdu v'kidshu, they get up and they do kiddushin. So they actually do the the marriage, right? Before you let them get married, you make the negotiations. They're happy with the negotiations, and the boy marries the girl, or the man marries the woman. Says says Rav Gidol Marav, Kanu, then that's a kinyan. There's no further need to get any kind of shtar, and we'll see in a second. But you probably don't need a shtar. And hein advarim aniknim ba'amira. This is an example where you can actually make a kinyan just through speech because of this context of marriage. Again, it's not something that usually would be the case, but because of the context of marriage, and so there's a lot of reasons why it might be different. We're going to discuss some of them in a minute. But one might just be that it's a normal way. Like this is just the way people distribute assets, right? Is that they understand two people are marrying, two families are joining in some way, and it's a normal thing to pass around possessions. So her family commits for whatever, his family commits for whatever, and that's enough to be koneh. That's what Rav Gidol Marav said. Okay, said Rava, not so simple. Mistavra milta de Rava bito na'ara. I think Rav was saying this, if the girl is getting married is 12 years old. Because if the girl is getting married is 12 years old, remember, anything that goes to her father, right? And so therefore, it makes sense that the father would make a kinyan, basically, because he's gaining from it. The kamati hanal yadeh, to the father. Aval bogeret, but if the girl is older than 12 and a half, so basically she's totally independent in Gemara terms, right, in halachic terms, nothing goes to the father. Well, then why would he commit himself? He's not actually gaining anything out of this. It's not like he's getting anything from this marriage. He had no responsibility to this daughter anyways. That's ridiculous. Elohim, but by God, meaning, reality, it's not the case. Amar Rav Afilo Bogaret. Obviously, Rav is saying even if the girl getting married was 100, or let's say a Bogaret, or 10, or not 10, 20 or 30. Dilo Temahachi, what about Aviha Ben? Right? What about the counterparty? The father of the daughter, I get it. If she's a minor or if she's the Na'ara, he gets what she gets. But the father of the boy never gets anything, right? He's always considered independent. So how could you say he's koneh? My hana italiyade. Ella, here we go. Finally, bahahi hana hadadi. Right? It's a tremendous joy for a parent to marry off their kid. And so that's the hana. The hana is not that he's getting more cash or he's getting something. It's that, look, every parent wants their child out of the house or finding the perfect match, and we'll put it that way. And so that's the hana'ah, that they're actually getting married. Gamri umatni lahadadi. Because of that, and again, there's a lot of ways to understand that. It could be that the mood is very happy, or the event is very important. It's a life cycle, right? So, but whatever it is, because of that context, the negotiations have much more value, much more commitment than they would in Stam, two people sitting together on a table and saying, I'll give you my car if you give me your baseball cards or something like that. Has no impact. So therefore, by weddings, by marriage, it has, it's koneh by words. Now, Amrle Ravina Ravashi, Ravina asked Ravashi, interesting question. Can you then write it down? Right? So it's true. They sat down at the wedding. Everyone was there. At the what do you call the Tanaim, right? The L'chaim thing, whatever you do before the chuppah. They had the Tanaim, they call it, yeah. They sat down there, and each family said what they're going to give. The question is, and there were a lot of witnesses. Next day, can you write it down on a piece of paper, and can it have force like something that's written down? Remember, things that are written down, you collect from the Chasim Mishubadim, right? They're much more valuable. Is this considered to be so formal that it can now be written down? So is it nitnuli katev? There's other ways to understand this, but I gave a simple one. Is it given to be written down? Oh, lo nitnuli katev, or is it just a verbal responsibility? So Amalei said to him, no, lo nitnuli katev. It's enforced, but it's not enforced strongly. You didn't write it down. If you want to write it down in the shtar, that's a whole nother question. You'd have to actually do it and make a kinyan, and do it formally. Eighth thing. That's the Gemara from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, the end of our Mishnah was, hapikachin. If you're a smart second husband and your wife comes to you and says, I have a child from a previous marriage, and I want you to write that you're going to sponsor that kid for 5 years, you would write how you kotvin, amninat she'izonet bitcha 5 shanim, kol zman she'ati mi. I will give your daughter food for 5 years, but on condition that she's still living with me. Now, it says Gemara, what do you mean you would write this down? Right? Everything seems to be verbal in our Mishnah. You're saying it, which is how we understood it before. Why is all of a sudden you say my kotfin, omrim, right? It should be why do you have to write it down? What it implies is that if you just said it verbally, like at the wedding, you couldn't later write it down. You have to specifically write it down at the time of the wedding in order for it to have force of something written down. Says, well, no, that doesn't prove anything, because when we say my kotvin, it means omrim, you say it. Says, well, what? The kari leila amirat ktiva, is it true that you, when you are referring to saying something, you call it writing it down? And we're in, yes, no, we've had a Mishnah before in the parak, 20 daf ago. That's not, we had a Mishnah before. Hakotev le'ishto, din dvarim ein ben achsayach. A man writes to his wife, I have no claims on your property. And we learned in the Gemara 3 weeks ago, Tani Rabbi Chia, ha'omer le'ishto, that in fact, it does not mean you wrote it. Din, when he says that, kotev le'ishto, it means you say to your wife. It means it's as if you wrote it. Ha'omer le'ishto. And so you see that sometimes when we say ktiva, it doesn't mean literally ktiva, it means amira, because some amira, now again, this is not how we pass it necessarily, but there's a possibility that some amira, some sayings are as strong as a writing. And in this context of marriage, again, either because the moment's very happy, everyone is really overly generous in their commitment, or because it's normal this way, that this is how you negotiate and pass around assets when you're joining together two estates, that amira, saying it in this context, is as powerful as actually writing it in a shtar. Okay, Tashma, we are halfway down, smack in the middle of the daf. Says the Gemara, there's a following braita in Kiddushin, Ein kotvin shtarei erusin v'nisuim. You can't write shtarot, you can't write a contract about marriage, ella midat shnehem, unless they both agree. What does that mean? It says, what it implies that midat shnehem, you can write it, right? Hamidat shnehem kotvim, implying that if you make it a negotiation, you sat down at the Tanaim, you negotiated that, the husband will get X and the wife will get X from their family's estates, or the wife's estate will give this and the husband's father will give that if they both agree the next day, you can write it into a shtar. Even though they didn't write it at that time, you're basically writing it after the fact. So the implication is that they both agree you're allowed to do that. So my lav shtarei psikta, presumably it means you can write down a shtar of a psikta, meaning negotiations. The shtar is going to say she gets, from her family's house every year 20 suits, and he gets from his family's house every year, 5 briskets or whatever they agreed to. So it sounds like you can write that. No, it's not what it's referring to. It's referring to shtarei eris and mamish. It's referring to a shtar that says they're getting married, right? The ketubah, basically, not the ketubah, just to be clear. But remember that you can get married, as we're going to learn in Kiddushin, through kesef, which is how we usually do it, by giving a monetary gift. But you can also get married through a shtar. A man can marry a woman just by writing a shtar. It says, I want to marry you. He doesn't have to give her anything besides the shtar, right? So that's what it's referring to. As long as they both agree, you can write a shtar of erison. And what's the chiddush? That's Rav Papa. That's like what Rav Papa said, and Rav Sharbia, the Itmar. Let's say, this is a question of Rav Papa and Rava. Itmar we said, let's say you write Katfu Lishma Mishalom Midata. Let's say, remember that a get, just remember this halacha, a get has to be written for a specific woman. It has to be written Lishma, right? So you can't go to the store and say, look, my name is Ruvain and my wife's name is Sarah. Do you have any get-in that are written from Ruvain to Sarah, right? Any pre-written get-in? You can't do that, right? It has to be written specifically by the sofer for a specific woman and a specific man. But remember that a get does not have to be written and given with the woman's dot. A man can, at least in Doraita, we have a lot of rules against this, but a man can divorce his wife without her knowing about it, right? He can deposit a get. The get does not require her dot. You can divorce Midoraita, you can divorce a woman Baal Karcha against her will. She does not have to accede or agree to the get. So the question is, what about marrying her? Can you marry a woman against her will, right?
She has to not, difference between knowing about it and against her will.
No, it could be either. It's the same thing, meaning she has to receive it ultimately, right?
Oh, so then she'd know about it.
No, but you so again, we'll get to and there's a lot of halachot around this, but you can give it to her and she not know what she took, but give her a sheet of papers and she accept them and say, I don't accept to be divorced. It doesn't matter, she's divorced. So you have to write it lishma, right? But yet it can be given shalom midata without her knowing about it or wanting it. So what about if you do the same thing by a marriage? Now you can't marry a woman against her death, right? But let's say when you wrote the shtar, you wrote it without her agreeing to marriage. She didn't even know about you. You had a dream. I'm going to marry this woman, and you wrote it with her in mind, lishma, and she doesn't know anything or agreed to it. And then you go and give it to her. So the question is that going to be okay? Because it's not okay by a get, and we compare gittin to kedushin in many ways. The Torah makes the comparison. So says the Gemara. Let's read the case. Katvu lishma v'shelo midata. Right? You write a get for her, but without her agreeing or knowing about it. Okay. So says Rava Viravina, Eno mikudeshet. There's no kedushin there because she didn't want to do it. So the fact that she accepted the shtar from you, but didn't know that it was to get married, does not obviously not make her married. However, say Rav Papa or Sharbi Amri, sorry, I use backwards. Rava and Ravina say she is mikudeshet, and Rav Papa and Rav Sharbia say she's eno mikudeshet, meaning you can only write a shtar if she knows about the time of the shtar. Now, obviously, if you give her a shtar and she says, I don't want this, she's not married to you. You can't force a woman to marry you. But the point is, at the time that you wrote the shtar, she did not have any agreement. She didn't even know who you were, maybe, right? You go over to her and hand her the shtar because the thing that you're marrying her with is not the value of the shtar, right? It's not kesef that you're giving her at this time. It's the shtar. And the time the shtar was written, she wasn't aware of it, then it's not enough. You have to write the shtar with her being aware of it. And so that's the chiddush of Rav Papi and Rav Sharpi. Tashma. Now, one final topic for today is what happens. Our Mishnah said the following, right? Well, not our Mishnah. The Gemara says, we'll get to our Mishnah in a second. Meito, this is a quote from our Mishnah, but we'll see the context. The Mishnah said, remember that, a husband, remember the case here, a husband married a woman who had a child from a previous marriage. He said, I'm going to commit to providing for that child. Then, for 5 years. Then the husband and wife got married, they had children, and then he died, okay? So now the children, the orphan children that had the father and mother, right, from this marriage, they are fed from the estate. But remember, they only get food from the chasim b'nei cholim, right? They only get food from cash in the estate, or land that's owned by the estate, but they cannot collect from property that was sold from the estate from earlier, okay? Even after they were born, right? Meaning, let's say they were born in 2019, and the father died in 2021, but he sold the field in 2020. You can't collect and say, oh, they were born in 2019, and there's a shibud from when they're born. You can't collect from the chasim mishubadim for food, right? But you can collect from the chasim mishubadim for the first daughter, for the daughter from the previous marriage, because that was written down on in a shtar, okay? So said the Gemara, we're going to quote that. Meito, if the husband dies, their daughters are fed from the chasim that are free, but this previous daughter from the previous marriage, what do you see from here? You see that even though, right, again, remember we kept understanding our Mishnah that you didn't do a proper shtar with names, because otherwise there'd be no chiddush. We're talking about a case where you did this sort of shtar, right? You wrote it down, but you didn't have any witnesses. What you see from here is that you're allowed to collect from Nechasim Mishubadim. How could you collect from Nechasim Mishubadim, right? It's not a shtar. It's a sort of a verbal agreement. This is where no, it's talking about a case where B'shekanu miyado. It was written down in this sort of fake kind of shtar, but then they actually made a kinyan. And once you make the kinyan, then of course that makes it real. This is where if you made a kinyan, right? So then I don't get it. If you made a separate agreement to basically pay for the daughter's food and you made a kinyan, then why don't you do the same thing for your own daughters, make a kinyan, and then you should be able to collect the nechasim mishubadim, right? This is where, well, it's talking about a case where you made a kinyan for these daughters, but not for those daughters. It's ridiculous, right? Like, I mean, what's the chiddush? Your Mishnah seems to be setting it up to tell you a difference between daughters from this marriage and daughters from that marriage. It turns out there's no difference. It's just that you said good morning to one, you didn't say good morning to the other, right? You did a kinyan for one and not for the other. It's nothing to do with the marriage then. So my paska, why would that happen? Like, why would it be that one marriage has anything to do with the fact that you made a kinyan or didn't make a kinyan? Says the Gemara, no, the reason is this. Ihi dahavi b'shat kinyan mahani la kinyan. Benot lahavi b'shat kinyan lo mahani la kinyan. Right? Case is that you made the kinyan at the time you got married. So this daughter from a previous marriage was already there. She existed. So the kinyan you made a responsibility to give food to that daughter from the chasim mishubadim. But then later you had other children. You never make a new kinyan. And so therefore they're not covered by this responsibility. I think it's interesting, but why are you limiting the Mishnah? Maybe the case in the Mishnah is where you had daughters that were already alive when you married this one with the ex-wife. Got it? No. Because says the Gemara, maybe the case is where Ruvain married this woman, Leah. They had 3 children. Then they got divorced. Then Leah married Shimon and had another daughter. And then she remarried Ruvain, which is a little tricky because you're not really supposed to remarry, right? So let's say Shimon died, okay? I don't know, we can think of other circumstances because he's not alive. In any event, Milo Askinan, Dahavi B'Shat Kinyan, maybe they existed B'Shat Kinyan, Me'echidami, Kigon Degarsha, Bahadra, right? So the example I gave is a little tricky. The other example is that Leah married Reuven and had a daughter. Then Leah married Shimon and had 2 daughters. Then Leah divorced Shimon and then remarried Shimon. So they already had children, they got remarried. And at the time they got remarried, Leah was like, look, I'm happy to remarry you, but I feel like you're not treating my daughter from Reuven very nicely. I want you to write in the ketubah, you're going to give her food for 5 years. Okay, it's reasonable. So there, they were both present at the time of the kinyan, right? All the daughters were alive. So why would it only work for the daughter from the previous marriage and not for the daughters from the current marriage? So here's the reason. Remember, the husband, when he marries a wife, he commits that I and my estate will support our children as long as they are not married, right? That's one of the Tanai Ketubot. That if the husband dies, the estate pays for the daughters as long as they live in the house. So there's a Tanai Beit Din that a father has to pay for his children even after he dies, or his estate does. But he doesn't have any commitment to pay for the previous marriage kids, right? For stepchildren. And so therefore, the first daughter, Diletta B'Tanai Beit Din, there's no provision of Beit Din to support her. So then Mahani Le Kinyan. So then when he makes the Kinyan to say, I'm going to support her, that has full force. But Banot, the daughters of their current marriage, or his daughters, the Itnu B'Tanai Beit Din, Lo Mahani Le Kinyan. Because they're basically being supported through a guarantee of Beit Din, a kinyan won't change that. So why would they be hurt by a kinyan, right? The fact that they're being supported by Beit Din shouldn't make a kinyan less likely. Migra gara? Ella, that's not the reason. The reason is Benotav, his daughters, Hainu Timer. The reason that they can never collect for food from the Chasim Mishubadim is because Kivan de Itnu B'Tanai Beit Din. Since the father has a responsibility from Beit Din to feed his own daughters after he dies, meaning his estate, we always are worried. We worry that he gave them cash before he died. We worry that because the father, we assume, not we worry, but because the father has a responsibility, he agreed to feed his children after his death, that on his deathbed, or when he knew he was sick, he handed off money to his daughters. And so later, and there's no documentation, later, when they come to court and say, we need money, we are nervous that we're not going to collect from Mechasim Mishubadim because there's a good chance that they really are not owed the money, right? Now, we can't prove that. So they can collect from Mechasim B'nei Chorim, but because he has a responsibility already, we assume he might have already given them some money, and therefore we don't let them collect from Mechasim Mishubadim. Okay? You want to do a little more? You can do a little more, right? Amr Chesson, second wide line on the daf says, I'm sorry.
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Amr Chesson, you know what? Let's not do it. Let's do it tomorrow. Okay? Hour before Mincha, upstairs. It's a long daf, but we'll have a lot of zitzfleisch, as they say. Okay.
Great.
Thank you for joining,
Great.
James. Chag Sameach. We'll
Eli
see
Chag
you tomorrow.
Sameach. Shua Tov.
So, maybe I'll see you later.
Look forward. Thank you.